Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, where it's Wednesday. That means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, I'll talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue on his channel will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And this week, Roger and I have returned with a fantastic episode because it's about Superman. It's about Superman once again. Now, a couple weeks ago, on this fantastic show, Epic Comic Book Wednesday, we talked about this book, The Greatest Superman Stories Ever Told, which was a paperback anthology from the 80s, which was made shortly after John Byrne showed up on the comic to revamp everything and change all kinds of stuff. And it has all kinds of wonderful stories in this volume. And it made me think about, well, this is what they considered at the time, which was right around Superman's 50th anniversary. This is what, they figured at the time was Superman's greatest stories ever told. Some of which I thought were pretty darn good. I agreed with most of it. I liked reading all of it because I'm a huge Superman fan. And because I'm a fan, I thought, why don't I do a video where I talk about my favorite Superman stories? If I were to come up with a book like that, it would have to be pretty long. But if I were to come up with a book like that, what would I choose for that volume? And so that's what we're doing. I'm going to do it in the form of a dopey top 10 list, because this channel's kind of dopey. So we might as well do it that way. And then Steve Donoghue on his channel is going to talk about his favorite Superman stories. So, my top 10 favorite Superman stories ever told. So, since we're doing this in the form of a dopey top 10 list, it's going to go 10 to 1, as that kind of list goes. I have written everything down in my handy notebook so I don't forget any of my favorite Superman stories. Number 10 on the list, number 10 of my favorites. I mean, I'm not saying that these are the best, but they're my favorites, so they're the best. So top 10, number 10 is this one, Panic in the Sky. It's Superman Panic in the Sky. Which, guest stars everybody, as you can see. This is kind of the ultimate Superman team-up. So, this is a story that came out in the early 90s. I got this trade paperback back in 1993. So it's been a while. I'm pretty sure I got this in 93. I think this is the original edition that I got it in. Let me just make sure that I'm not... Yeah, it was 1993 when I picked this up. So Panic in the Sky. So, early 90s. So it's been a few years since Superman was revamped by John Byrne. And so this is still John Byrne's Superman, basically. But I feel like John Byrne's Superman got a lot better and more interesting after John Byrne left the book. It just worked out that way. And this is a huge storyline that took place across all the Superman comics at the time. It features my favorite villain of all time, which would be Brainiac. My favorite Superman villain was Brainiac. And this features a threat from War World. Panic in the Sky was actually an episode from the television series. And so they took that title from that episode, Panic in the Sky, and they titled this storyline after it. And it's a lot of fun. It starts off with John Byrne's version of Supergirl. Not the original version of Supergirl, unfortunately, because DC Comics was lame and killed her off. But she did return, as, of course she would. But this is just a really fun, really big, really entertaining team-up story where all the superheroes basically show up to fight Brainiac and the threat of War World. And of course we've got Batman shows up, Everybody shows up. Captain Marvel's in here. The original Captain Marvel. You may know him as Shazam, which was the word he used because the wizard that made him a superhero was named Shazam. He's Captain. It's confusing. Captain Marvel's confusing. We'll have to do an episode about Captain Marvel. You know what? Steve and I are going to have to do an episode about Captain Marvel. There, of course, is the evil Brainiac. The evil Brainiac. But as kind of team-up event type stories go, this one was just tremendously fun. And so, yeah, an early 90s story. And I really enjoyed, actually, the 90s Superman, at least until they killed him. But then, you know, the Superman comic was still interesting after Superman was killed. The actual story where Superman died was not my favorite. I didn't even find it particularly interesting, to tell you the truth, the way the story was told. But there was a lot of good stuff running up to that, and a lot of good stuff that came after that, even though Superman came back with a super mullet. That was an embarrassing time. But this particular moment was very entertaining, and it is one of my favorites. It's Panic in the Sky. That's number 10. I'll shut up about that particular story now and go on to number 9. Number 9, which I have in here. This is Superman's 85th anniversary collection. And this is the Three Supermen from Krypton. The Three Supermen from Krypton, which showed up in Superman issue number 65. Now, technically, this was still a Golden Age story, but it was 1950. And so it's edging into the Silver Age. And this story, it feels very Silver Age to me. And so we have 3 criminals from Krypton who were banished on Krypton into a spaceship into suspended animation by none other than Superman's father, Jor-El. And there's Jor-El there. There's Jor-El banishing these super villains, which show up on Earth, and now Superman has to find a way to defeat these 3 villains. Now, this is difficult because they're all just as strong as Superman. So Superman has to use his clever brain to figure out a way to defeat these 3. So, of course, this idea was used again later. Any of you who saw Superman 2 know that this basic storyline was used again. But this original story is just a lot of fun. I loved it. I loved it when I first read it. I love it now. So yeah, the 3 Supermen from Krypton. That was number 9. That was number 9. Number 8. Number 8. Let's find it. I have this one in a celebration of 75 years. I've actually got this in a couple places. But let me dig up this story. If I could find the page. I probably should have marked these better. Okay, here it is. Here it is. Here it is. No, this is the death of Superman. That's just what I was talking about, the death of Superman. Not my favorite. This is the one. What's so funny about truth, justice, and the American way? So this is actually turned out to be a rather popular Superman story, because it's all about this group of, well, you can hardly call them superheroes. It's about this group called the Elite, and they are, you know, superheroes who are ruthless and violent, and they get people killed, and they're kind of like the gritty superheroes. And this story is playing on the idea that Superman is, you know, outdated. His Boy Scout routine, you know, because he's such a good guy. He's such a Boy Scout. His, you know, he's old school. He's too old school, you know. And in this story, it shows that that is actually Superman's strength. His strength is that he's a big Boy Scout with these old, some would say outdated values. And so in the end, of course, he kicks all of their asses. Look at him there. And it's just awesome. So yeah, it's a great story. Truth. And what's so funny about truth, justice, and the American way? A story you couldn't even use the title of nowadays, probably. So that was number 8. Number 7. Okay, this is one of the greatest stories of all time, featuring one of the greatest characters of all time, which I have in this volume. This is Superman in the 50s. I had to cut there because it took me a long time to find the right place. Here it is. It's Krypto, the Superdog. Krypto, the Superdog. It's Krypto, it's Krypto, the Superdog. Of course it is. So technically, this is a Superboy story. So some people would say it shouldn't count. But you know what? Superman, Superboy, they're the same guy. They're the same guy. So and this is the Superdog from Krypton. So Krypto is the greatest. He's next to Superman. Krypto is obviously the greatest comic book character ever to appear in comic books. Now, it turns out that Krypto was sent out in space before Superboy was sent. You know, it's not right to test on animals. Krypto was sent out in space before Superman was. So Krypto was sent out in space, but just showed up on Earth when Superman was Superboy. And so, you know, they have fun, they hang out. Krypto tears apart this plane, you know, because he's just playing. Krypto is just as badly behaved, I think, in this story as my dogs are. Krypto's a lot smarter than my dogs, I have to say. But he seems to cause just as much trouble. But, you know, he's chasing comets around. He's a lot of fun, Krypto, the Superdog. He doesn't have his costume in this story yet, although on the cover they do give him a cape, and he did eventually get his cape, Krypto, the Superdog. So this is just a wonderful story. Eventually Krypto's like, you're too boring for me, Superboy. I'm going to go off in space and have fun. But don't worry, he comes back. He comes back, Krypto does. John Byrne tried to get rid of Krypto, but it didn't take. Krypto returned. You know, of course he would. He's the best. So, yeah. There's that story. So that was number 7. Okay, so number 6. Number 6 is actually an origin story. There have been quite a few origin stories. And this origin story, this is Superman Birthright, showed up in the early 2000s. And this was by Mark Waid, who's a great comic book writer. And he really understands the character of Superman. And so we have a really in-depth, really interesting, really well-written origin story for Superman. Which I guess they kind of needed, because up to this point, John Byrne's origin for Superman, that was the last origin that there was. And that was not the best Superman origin story, in my opinion. There were a lot of things about John Byrne's revamp I didn't care for, even at the time when I read it, but especially in hindsight after I had read a lot more Superman. Not my favorite origin story, but this one is really, really good. And so Mark Waid updated Superman's story in a really cool way, because he brought back a lot of stuff from the Golden and Silver Age, which John Byrne had just gotten rid of. And he did it all in a clever way. And he also kept some of the stuff that worked from the revamp, from John Byrne's revamp. So it's really cool. It's an excellent read, a great Superman origin story, I think, with a lot of cool moments. We've got Lex Luthor, who's super evil, as usual. It takes also some stuff from the film. Let me see if I could find that scene. When Superman first shows up on the scene, Lois Lane is in danger in a helicopter, and Superman saves Lois Lane in the helicopter, which of course he does in Superman the movie. So it kind of picks out a bunch of different stuff from previous incarnations of Superman and previous origin stories, and then does a bunch of other stuff that he just throws in there, original to this story. So it's really cool, and it actually has a really touching ending to the story, which I will not spoil, but it's great. It's great. So yeah, Superman Birthright, really good origin story. This was his origin was revamped again just a few years later, but this one I think is better than that one was, as good as that one was. I think Superman Birthright was excellent. So there's that. Number 5. Okay, this is a good one. I have this in Superman versus Lex Luthor, a paperback full of Lex Luthor stories. So Lex Luthor, of course, is Superman's chief bad guy, and this story is the showdown between Luthor and Superman. So Luthor, in this story, he just can't win. He just hates Superman so much, and he just can't defeat him. This is the thing with Luthor. His chief character trait is he hates Superman. He can't stand that Superman exists, because as long as Superman exists, he's not, he's not the greatest, most powerful human being. There's always somebody out there more powerful than him, and frankly a better person, obviously, and that's Superman. So he can't live with himself as long as Superman exists. So Superman becomes an obsession for him, And in this story, he challenges Superman to a fight. As he says in this broadcast, as he cuts in on a TV station, Superman has never yet dared meet me, Luthor, man to man, on even terms. I challenge him to meet me in a fair fight without his superpowers to help him. So they go to a planet where Superman doesn't have a yellow sun to give him superpowers, and they just go at it in this Kurt Swan scene. And this is Kurt Swan, one of the greatest Superman artists of all time. And it's a really kind of a brutal fight for a fight to happen in the 50s. And yeah, it's an excellent fight where they just like kick the crap out of each other. But of course, Superman wins the first round of this fight. But then Luthor runs into some inhabitants on this planet, the native inhabitants, and he actually ends up helping them. He doesn't really care about helping them too much. He's just trying to find a way to defeat Superman. But in so doing, he helps the inhabitants of this planet, and they make him a hero, which is kind of interesting. Of course, he uses dirty tricks to try to defeat Superman with robot dogs. You just can't trust Luthor. And of course, Luthor is defeated in the end, but he did actually help the people on that planet, and he ended up their hero. If only they knew what a scumball Lex Luthor really was. So yeah, that was that. That was the showdown between Luthor and Superman. So now we go to number 4. Okay, number 4 is Superman Comes to Earth. This was another origin story, but this is the one that was in the newspaper strip. This is the dailies, 1939 to 1942. And what's interesting about this, not only is its quality, because it's actually really, really well done. This was done by the creators of Superman. If I can get this up here, Siegel and Schuster. And this is the first time the full origin of Superman was told. The first time we meet Jor-El and Lara, the first time they talk about and they talk about the rocket which brings Superman to Earth. And it's really kind of touching. I mean, here we are at the birth of Superman, or shortly afterwards, and Jor-El is so happy, but then an earthquake hits very shortly after Superman's birth. And so, of course, Superman's dad figures out exactly what's going on, and he tries to convince, of course, the scientists and politicians of Krypton what's going on. They don't believe him, because why should the scientist with all this evidence be believed? Can't do that. And so Jor-El's original plan was to make these giant ships to launch to other worlds, but he only made a test ship, which is this little rocket that, it can only fit one. And there's this little rocket here, and it only has room in it for his young infant child. So, of course, he sends the infant child off. But there's so much detail in this newspaper story. Certainly more detail than had ever been told before. And it still holds up. It's just like an excellent story, and very touching. And there's the dramatic end of Krypton. It's just brilliantly told and really well done. So one of the better origin stories for Superman was from that newspaper strip, and I think it's great. So there's that. Superman comes to Earth, which brings us to number three. Number three, Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow? So this is by Alan Moore and Kurt Swan. And it's wonderful. So in 1986, John Byrne was hired to take over the Superman title. And he decided to revamp everything. He's going to change everything. He's going to get rid of a lot of Superman's mythology, which has been built up over the years. He's getting rid of the idea that Superman was ever Superboy. He's getting... Supergirl died in Crisis, so there's no Supergirl. And all of the other stuff that had been built up over the years, all that was coming to an end. And so what was done in this story by Alan Moore is that this wraps up the story of Superman up to that point. Every issue of Superman up to that point, after John Byrne's revamp, was automatically turned into imaginary stories. Continuity-wise, none of those stories happened. And this is the end of that story. And it's just beautifully told. The artwork is magnificent. There's Krypto, of course. Got to have Krypto in the last Superman story. You have all the Superman villains. You have Brainiac, you have Luthor. But the way it's done, this has beautiful moments, touching moments, terrifying and disturbing moments. It has quite a tragic ending, which is not surprising. Superman, particularly in the Silver Age stories, there was always an element of tragedy running through the Superman stories, because he is a person who basically had lost everything when he lost his world. He lost his culture, he lost his family, he lost everything, and he was an orphan. And that sense of tragedy hangs over the series. No matter how much fun and goofy nonsense showed up in the Superman comic books, that sense of tragedy was always there. And so it's appropriate this ended with some tragedy. And it's just a beautiful story and a beautiful end to the Silver and Bronze Age Superman. If it had to end, and I guess it did, this was the way to end it. And it's great that Kurt Swan illustrated it. That's very fitting, because he was the main Superman artist for years, and he's a great artist. So this was a fantastic story. That was number 3. And you're like, well, what can top that? So number 2, let's see if I could find number 2. Here it is. Now, I just have a really soft spot for this story, for number 2. It is almost my number 1 story, but not quite. And that is the Super Duel in Space. The Super Duel in Space. This has a Kurt Swan cover with Brainiac there. Like I said, Brainiac is my favorite Superman villain. And this is the first Brainiac story. There's Brainiac there. And Brainiac, his whole thing is he flies around in space and he shrinks cities. And he actually shrunk down a Kryptonian city, Kandor. So the city in the bottle, Kandor. There's Kandor there. And so Superman has to find a way. He is shrunk down to tiny size. And he has to find a way to defeat Brainiac and save Kandor. And he wants to find a way to restore Kandor, but of course he doesn't manage to do that. So he saves the bottled city until he can. And it's full of just great moments. I think it's Al Plastino who did this story and did this art. You have Brainiac there looking down into the bottled city. It's great. And it's full of just awesome stuff. We get, his time. He spent some time in Kandor. It's just really cool. And I love it. I love that story. It is absolutely one of my favorites. It's almost my favorite story. But of course, then comes number 1, the greatest Superman story ever told. I don't think anyone will argue with this because this was a masterpiece. It's a masterpiece of comic book art and story. It might be the greatest comic book of all time. What could it possibly be? Well, of course, it's Superman versus Muhammad Ali. Superman versus Muhammad Ali, man. Now, this is the Superman comic book that I've owned the longest. And it is awesome. It is just amazing where Superman and Muhammad Ali have to team up to fight aliens and to defeat an alien armada. Neil Adams just does some amazing artwork in this book. It's basically a graphic novel in this big super special format, this big oversized format. And it's brilliant. It's amazing. I did a whole video on this book. I'll try to remember to link it down below. I'll try to remember. But I did do a whole video on Superman versus Muhammad Ali. This had a great... I must have read this over and over again. Of course, we are the greatest, Superman. We are the greatest. I do have a newer edition of this, but it's not this size. And the size of this thing actually does make a difference. It's very impressive. It's a very impressive book. And yeah, it's magnificent. Definitely, I think, like I said, this is obviously the greatest Superman story ever told. I mean, what's better than this? Nothing. So there you go, my top 10 Superman stories of all time. I hope you enjoyed it. We, Roger and I, will catch you next time.